Greetings everybody and welcome to the show. I want to do one on this book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, Yuval Noah Harari. As you can see, I got it for a special discounted price. Some friends a few years ago told me I should watch Harari. They thought I'd be into him, and at first when I watched his videos I was like, this guy seems to be making some sense. But as time went on, I began to get a bit concerned about what it is he's actually selling, and whether he is part of the dreaded New World Order. So this little show is about this book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And I wanted to start by discussing it in the introduction, how he talks about what this book's all about, and how he's concerned about what's going to happen to humanity in the future. But he says, and I quote, "My interest here is less in the eventual creation of inorganic life and more in the threat to the welfare and state and to particular institutions such as the European Union," end quote. Because he's talking in this book about what are the long-term prospects for humanity. Where are we going socially, economically, and politically? And he's seen that there's loads of crises that's been happening in the last few years, which I agree with him on this. There has been. And he's concerned about where technology is going to take us. It offers us lots of, as he calls it, wonderful promises, but his intention is to highlight mainly the threats and dangers. And he says, I quote, "Since the corporations and entrepreneurs who lead the technological revolution naturally tend to sing the praises of their creations, it falls to sociologists, philosophers and historians like myself to sound the alarm and explain all the way things can go terribly wrong," end quote. Which is something obviously a lot of us are concerned about. We've seen the movies of the rise of the AI and the rise of the robots and how they suddenly see us humans as parasites or see a better way of running the world. Please see my book, Monkey Mind, Robot Body, where I do a version of what I think could have been coming in the future. And he talks about how humankind, and I'm going to quote here, can rise to the occasion if we keep our fears under control and a bit more humble about our views, end quote, which is quite interesting. I do see there's a lot of fear-mongering going on out there. There's a lot of doom and gloom and porn scrolling, or fear scrolling. I might have got that round the wrong way. Not porn scrolling, though there is too many people watching porn. But there is a lot of fear going on about what's going to happen with the future. A lot of people are going down various rabbit holes. And I do agree with him. Homo sapiens need to make more sense of the world. And he also says, quote, "Is Homo sapiens capable of making sense of the world it has created," end quote. And I wonder that. I find a lot of people have a lot of despondence to this and not particularly concerned about where this world's going or what's happened to this world. And then on the other hand, we have a lot of people that have gone to the other extreme of really want to try and protect this world and save nature and wildlife and humanity. Obviously, we've got far too many people still starving, too many homeless people, too many people struggling with their bills and such like. And he asked the questions which I often try to ask people to consider in my videos. Who are we? Where are we going? What are you doing with your life? And he goes on to ask what kind of skills will we need for the future. And I'm going to just give a quote here. "Given everything we know and don't know about science, about God, about politics and about religion, what can we say about the meaning of life today?" end quote. Which again is one of my main concerns about humanity and people. They have no concern about what the meaning of life is. They just live day by day, following a materialistic or secular life. Some may have a spiritual yearning towards finding or discovering what the divine is. But people, and I think he's talking about the majority here, don't seem to have that. They're not concerned about the philosophy of what life is or whether religion should be a part of it. and how science is obviously changing a lot of things. And I know people have been discussing these subjects for a long time. But he says, and I quote, "Before embarking on this intellectual journey, I would like to highlight one crucial point. Much of the book discusses the shortcomings of the liberal worldview and of the democratic system. I do so not because I believe liberal democracy is uniquely problematic, but rather because I think it is the most successful and most versatile political model humans have so far developed for dealing with the challenges of the modern world. While it may not be appropriate for every society in every stage of development, it has proved its worth in more societies and in more situations than any of the alternatives. Therefore, when examining the new challenges that lie ahead of us, it is necessary to understand the limitations of liberal democracy and to explore how we can adapt and improve its current institutions." End quote. Of course, where our political allegiance lies is for the individual. But I too would like to think that every human would consider what is best for humanity itself and not necessarily for the individual. Where do we look at what kind of people are trying to run the world? Are they doing it for the greater, the greater part of humanity, or are they just doing it for themselves? Obviously, we have a lot of regimes out there, which he also talks about, regimes that are like dictatorships and tyrants running the world. And he talks about how a lot of people are not free. And one of the things I'm very concerned about is we need to bring liberty and freedom to each and every person on this planet, though there are many countries that still run a controlled type of living. And he does finish his introduction about, if you value this book, you should also value the freedom of expression, which I do as well very much agree with. And I've done quite a few shows in the last few years about how I feel like we're losing our freedom of speech. He goes on to talk about, in part 1, the technological challenge. And he talks about humankind is losing faith in the liberal story that dominated global politics in recent decades. And I would agree with that. People are losing faith in the people that run our world, the Western world. I'm mainly talking about now. But how do we improve it? How do we get the right people who have a moral and ethical way of looking at the world in charge? What makes the world go round? Usually money. And he also goes on to discuss about the merger of biotech and infotech that is coming, we're going to be confronting soon. He sees it as one of the biggest challenges that humankind has ever encountered, which I too believe in, that what's coming with the future technology could be a very big problem. But going into chapter 1, which he calls disillusionment, he talks about how this planet is dominated by tyrants. And I'm going to quote here, "Even in the most liberal countries, many citizens suffer from poverty, violence and oppression. But at least we know what we need to do in order to overcome these problems, give people more liberty. We need to protect human rights, to grant everybody the vote, to establish free markets and to let individuals, ideas and goods move throughout the world as easily as possible." End quote. All sounds great. I agree with him on that. We do need to do this. But then he goes on to say, quote, "According to this liberal panacea, accepted in slight variations by George W. Bush and Barack Obama alike, if we just continue to liberalize and globalize our political and economic systems, we will produce peace and prosperity for all." End quote. Now, I read that as he's saying their way is the way forward. I'm not sure about this. I can see a lot of faults in the Bush regime, as many of us do. They're very war-driven. He goes on to say, quote, Countries that join this unstoppable march of progress will be rewarded with peace and prosperity sooner. Countries that try to resist the inevitable will suffer the consequences until they too see the light, open their borders and liberalise their societies, their politics and their markets. It may take time, but eventually even North Korea, Iraq and El Salvador will look like Denmark or Iowa, end quote. Sounds great, but also sounds a bit New World ordery. One world market, one world politics perhaps, I don't know. Hopefully it's not going that way. And I was quite concerned to see that Harari was part of the Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab and such like, who have been trying to bring forward the Great Reset. But he goes on later to talk about how Brexit and the rise of Donald Trump signified the moment when this tidal wave of disillusionment reached the core liberal states of Western Europe and North America, end quote. So he's talking about how what many would see as now as alternative is causing a problem with how New World Order is trying to rise. And he goes on to say, quote, whereas a few years ago Americans and Europeans were still trying to liberalise Iraq and Libya at the point of the gun, many people in Kentucky and Yorkshire now have come to see the liberal vision as either undesirable or unattainable. Some discovered a liking for the old hierarchical world, and they just don't want to give up their racial, national or gendered privileges. Others have concluded, rightly or wrongly, that liberalisation and globalisation are a huge racket empowering a tiny elite at the expense of the masses, end quote. Myself was kind of thinking that that is what's been happening. So it's like he's trying to explain here that that is not what's going to happen, and instead we're going to have a lovely new world where everybody gets on and the borders have been lowered and we all share the world together and the markets. But in some ways we're going to make everything free and equal for everyone. He talks about how there is no global story anymore for our world to follow. He talks about how the different old stories, or the stories of old, don't fit in with what's going on with this world we're living in at the moment. We are a lot of different ideas and stories and different thoughts, philosophies and such like are out there. So he's saying that a lot of people are feeling lost, even perhaps terrified that there is no guidance or a guardian to show us how we should all live like we have done in the last millennia or perhaps more. Perhaps we had the Romans had their Roman civilization and the Greeks had theirs and such like. He's saying that this is all causing disorientation. And disorientation, quote, causes them to think in apocalyptic terms, as if the failure of history to come to an envisioned happy ending can only mean that it is hurtling towards Armageddon, end quote. And I would agree with that. A lot of people, myself included, felt that we're living in apocalyptic times. But people are getting back on track now. We had quite a few shocks, haven't we, in the last few years of what's been happening to this world as people suddenly realise they don't like what it is, how their countries are running. We've had all the Arab Springs and the changing governments in America with what would be termed back in the day of shock that Donald Trump had got in and such like. And I should just add that Harari wrote this book in 2018. I wonder what his views would be about all this now. He goes on to talk about how do we put people back on track? How do we stop this sense of disorientation and impending doom? He talks a lot about how computers have helped make people more in contact with each other around the world, but it's also in control of our financial systems. and some people don't feel safe with this. He also talks about how money might run out and discusses how these blockchain networks and cryptocurrencies might completely revamp the monetary system. So again, myself, I'm quite concerned about that, because that would be a control of money, where I do like cash. I do like to use my money. I like to try and pay for things as much as I can with cash. I don't want to end up, as many of the future movies show us, or futuristic movies of, we're all using a card to pay for everything and use as ID. Everything's on one card. You have to earn credits to be able to have medical treatment and such like. Kind of concerned as how this is going to happen. And he says, quote, "In the past, we humans have learned to control the world outside us, but we had very little control over the world inside us. We knew how to build a dam and stop a river from flowing, but we did not know how to stop the body from aging. We knew how to design an irrigation system, but we had no idea how to design a brain. If mosquitoes buzzed in our ears and disturbed our sleep, we knew how to kill the mosquitoes, but if a thought buzzed in our mind and kept us awake at night, most of us did not know how to kill the thought." End quote. Which is, very true. I do have a lot of people discussing how thoughts just come into them, and I believe thoughts do come into you from other realms maybe, or the thought flows through the ether and we're picking up thoughts from other people. Our thoughts do not seem to be our own. What's he saying here? Is he trying to say that we need to learn, or something's going to happen to stop us thinking? He then goes on to say, and I'm going to quote, "The revolutions in biotech and infotech will give us control of the world inside us and will enable us to engineer and manufacture life. We will learn how to design brains, extend lives, and kill thoughts at our discretion. Nobody knows what the consequences will be. Humans will always far better at inventing tools than using them wisely." End quote. Wisdom comes with knowledge and being, as Gurdjieff would say. But he goes on to say about how it would be easy to redirect the flow of our minds than to divine what it will do to our personal psychology. He's talking about how we need to be able to control our thoughts, perhaps through some kind of biotechnology that he's talking about in the paragraph above. Is he warning us that the coming technology might try and take control of our bodily functions? He says, quote, "In the past we have gained the power to manipulate the world around us and to reshape the entire planet, but because we didn't understand the complexity of the global ecology, the changes we made inadvertently disrupted the entire ecological system, and now we face an ecological collapse." End quote. I'm kind of with him in this. We've got too much pollution going out into the air, definitely too many people just dropping litter everywhere, no longer having respect for the planet. So we need to teach people how to respect their planet so they don't become the litter bugs that they are. Only losers drop litter. He goes on to say, quote, "In the coming century, biotech and infotech will give us the power to manipulate the world inside us and reshape ourselves. But because we don't understand the complexity of our own minds, the changes we will make might upset our mental system to such an extent that it too might break down." End quote. Interesting, hey? So he's saying that this system might not work first off, and people have to, it's like being reprogrammed, but by the programs of the computers. He says that all these revolutions in biotech and infotech obviously are made by engineers and scientists who may not particularly understand, and I'm with him on this, the political implications of these decisions. Yeah, and I'm also concerned about how all this might be some kind of disruption to our own freedom of will, our own freedom of thought. We won't be individuals anymore. We'll be becoming roboticized. As one of my friends recently reminded me, we working class people are not inept, talentless idiots whose dreams need to be neglected for our own good. And sometimes I feel all this planning of what's going to happen to us in the future, of being linked to some kind of neural network or having control of our thoughts by some chip being put into it so we no longer we can disregard thoughts that we don't want. Is that taking away our freedom to think for ourselves? Sheldon Cooper said that chips should only be inserted into brains that would explode each time someone said something stupid. I think what I'm concerned about is this all an attempt to try and modify our behaviour. Though most people are good people. Obviously we would all like to have all the crime to stop in this world, all the hurt and pain by those that don't feel that they are part of society and go forward, beating people up randomly, or in Britain we have the problem with the knife crime. That would be a good thing to stop. But putting perhaps a chip in someone's head or biotechnology, is that the way to do it, rather than helping them to understand that what they do is wrong, that they're not being ethical or moral, and to help them find a way to be part of society, rather than feeling that society is against them, which is why most people turn to crime or do awful, heinous acts, is because they don't feel they belong, which has been the main problem for a long time. How do we rectify this? How do we help people feel that they are part of a society? Again, society needs a bit of a rework in itself, really. How to accept that each other person is a human being. How to stop children being abused physically and emotionally, who then grow up into broken adults, don't become, as I've discovered myself from working with the general public, many adults don't grow up at all. They become adults and still children. How do we help with that? Does it need to be done through biotechnology? I myself disagree with that. Maybe we're all just too disconnected to be connected. How do we reconnect with each other? How do we learn to understand that that's a human being you're looking at? Which is one of the problems with many people these days, thinking that not everyone's a human being, that aliens walk among us, that other beings walk among us. I myself think that sometimes. But to bring humanity back together, we need to somehow reconnect. So there's going to be many different types of groups and peoples, societies and such like, that are all got their own ideas of how to reconnect humanity back together so that we can live on this world together. I grew up with Bob Marley and the likes of Hawkwind and such like, which were always on about the one love. We all need the one love, the unconditional love for each other. But what's happened? Why do we not have that anymore? This is obviously one of my own ideas of how to bring humanity back together. But how many people want to listen? How many people poo-poo any kind of thought forms like that, of having to deal with love? They've got to deal with themselves first. And I do see how many people are broken, so they need to find a way of being fixed so that they can then understand that everybody else can be fixed too. Many people like being broken, as Gurdjieff says, people like their suffering. So that makes it quite difficult to try and create a society where everyone gets along, when then there are still those that want to drag themselves down with their suffering. There are, of course, many people out there that like to be told what to do, probably because they don't have confidence in themselves or understand how to navigate their way through this lunatic asylum. So they look up to leaders to help them, to advise them. We just need moral, ethical people to advise one and all. But who has that right to do that? Who has that right to be in charge? Humanity is complex. Yet there seems to be people trying to simplify our way of living, which maybe would make us better humans towards each other, in a simpler way of living or being. Yet we are, as I said, complex creatures. And maybe that's what those in charge don't like. But coming back to the stories that Harari is saying that humanity has lost in this world, which I find quite interesting because Joseph Campbell says we must bring back the myths or recreate myths for the modern age. And Harari is saying that humanity's lost its mythology, its stories for the present time. Well, I think that's what he's trying to say. Anyway, I'm going to just do a little quote from the same chapter, Disillusionment. Quote, "We are consequently left with the task of creating an updated story for the world. Just as the upheavals of the Industrial Revolution gave birth to the novel ideologies of the 20th century, so the coming revolutions in biotechnology and information technology are likely to require fresh visions. The next decades might therefore be characterized by intense soul-searching and by formulating new social and political models. Could liberalism reinvent itself yet again, just as it did in the wake of the 1930s and 1960s crises, emerging as more attractive than ever before? Could traditional religion and nationalism provide the answers that escape the liberals, and could they use ancient wisdom to fashion an up-to-date world view? Or perhaps the time has come to make a clean break with the past and craft a completely new story that goes beyond not just the old gods and nations, but even the core modern values of liberty and equality." End quote. Now, I'm all up for the old gods. I'm also all up for the new gods. I find that people's faith and belief in a religion or in an old god or a new god or whatever normally helps them have a more ethical and moralistic view of the world. I'm not saying that only moralistic and ethical people are religious. There are lots of non-religious atheist people out there who have good morals and good ethics. Of course they do. You know, it's not a judgment of which religion is the better in this case. But how do we get across the ideas of morality and ethical laws to help humans live together, rather than everything turning into a world of chaos, kind of Mad Max scenario of everybody just living for themselves and having no concern for anybody else, no consideration? And also, I do agree with what he's saying here about nations. I do think nations and nationalities do divide people. We are one world, one people, one love. Yet at the same time, we've got still the nations divided, borders. We have obviously the encouragement of supporting your nation in the sports events or in other competitions and such like, in wars. Is this a good thing? How do we recognise that we are all one people? Do we drop the borders and become one world? Which does kind of tend towards New World Order. But then maybe if we had the right people in charge, that would work. As Gurdjieff says, if we had 200 awakened people, we could solve all the problems in this world. I think Steiner says it's less, so we need some of you people out there to wake up. I mean, encouraging people to reach that point where they can see through all the troubles of this world. They can see through why the world is in the state it's in and why humanity is in the state it is in. Yet, as we know, humanity does turn on people who become either enlightened or can try and show a better way of living. That herd mentality can be easily driven by the governments and the leaders, or the current leaders, who don't want to see humanity living in a more prosperous, and not just in monetary, but in a humane way. But continuing with Harari, what he says next I find quite interesting. It's something I've been all for as well. So I'm going to just quote. "So what next? The first step is to tone down the prophecies of doom and switch from panic mode to bewilderment. Panic is a form of hubris. It comes from the smug feeling that I know exactly where the world is heading. Down. Bewilderment is more humble and therefore more clear-sighted. If you feel like running down the street crying, "The apocalypse is upon us," try telling yourself, "No, it's not that. Truth is, I just don't understand what's going on in the world." End quote. And I totally agree with him on that. Most of the doom and gloom and the conspiracy theories is from people that don't exactly know what's going on in the world. But then who does? Who of us actually understands how the world runs? Each person sees the world from a subjective point of view. But it is good to be aware of governments or our leaders who are causing economic problems or global problems or humanitarian problems. We've got to be aware that when civilization or humanity in various countries is disgruntled, obviously something's wrong with the leadership of that country if most of the people are disgruntled. We don't like to be controlled, but sadly governments do try to control us. And this all leads to people going down rabbit holes of all kinds of conspiracy theories. And I've seen, especially in the last few years of what's been going on, the shit show of 2020 and such like, there was a lot of panic. And what does panic breed? As he says here, it breeds hubris. And instead of, like, I used to not like the word bewilderment. I used to think it was like wide-eyed and not knowing what was going on. But now I see that bewilderment, it can be more humbling. It can make you take a step back and try to see things from a whole view rather than a narrow-minded view that much panic and doom and gloom brings. So I do agree with him that truth is what we should be trying to discover in ourselves and in life. Well, one thing I do disagree with Harari is because in the next paragraph he starts talking about artificial intelligence and its potential impact on our lives. He seems to think that it's going to slow down. It's not going to be as much a revolution as most of the scientists and such like say to us. He says, quote, "It is undoubtable, however, that the technological revolutions will gather momentum in the next few decades and will confront humankind with the hardest trials we have ever encountered." End quote. Well, I actually think he's wrong there. I think the technical revolution is speeding up and will gather momentum, and it's not going to be in the next few decades, it's going to be in the next few years. And we will be confronting humanity's hardest trials, though he does say that's going to happen, but he thinks it's many years away. I think there is going to be some big choices coming up soon about where we're going with this biotechnology and who wants to become part of the cyborg technology that is predicted, or whether they still want to stay as a organic human. See my book, Monkey Mind, Robot Body. But even Rudolf Steiner says that at some point we will merge with the machines. But this is an important thing. It needs to be moral technology. We need to, from Steiner's point of view, we need to have advanced to understand how true morality works, and how we need to all to be moral in our hearts and minds, so that we can then work with the machines, and the machines they work for us, not the machines take over our lives like we're seeing today when we walk down the street or sit on a public transport and see everyone on their phones. It was quite interesting the other day, though. I actually was on a tube and I could see that quite a few people were reading physical books, which was really good to see, really made me smile. And which is something I hadn't seen for a while. Everyone usually is on their phones. But yeah, get back reading on public transport, people, proper books. Which again is another way of learning about things. I know I'm reading from a book here, Harari's book, but I also think I need to look at the people that, such as him, who I wasn't sure if I trust or not. I need to see what they're putting across. In 2020, Klaus Schwab himself brought out his book about the Great Reset, which I did get a copy of, and it was very interesting reading. So we don't need to just read books that entertain us or things that are what we're for, pro our own thoughts. We also need to look at what the opposition's up to. And it's quite telling what they say in their books. And what Harari's trying to say in this 21 Lessons book is that humanity needs a new, meaningful narrative. And I can see where he's coming from for that. I think a lot of people are lost because we don't have the guidelines or the narrative that everybody's had in the last few millennia. Everyone just followed a certain way, depending on their nation and their country, what kind of progress they were making. Whether it was probably more business-like than spiritual or soulful. Though a technological revolution is happening now, as we know, and that could be changing humanity forever. Chapter 2 of Harari's book is called Work. When you grow up, you might not have a job. And he's kind of stating how many jobs are going to be taken over by technology. As many of us know, the AI is going to take out a lot of jobs. I already know artists that are losing jobs because rather than companies employing actual human artists to do their signage and such like, they're getting the AI to do all their designing. Obviously that's a lot cheaper and possibly even quicker, I don't know, but obviously many people are aware of this. I seem to be saying obviously a lot in this show. Maybe I should just call it obviously. Obviously what's coming. But one thing that Harari does talk about is what's going to happen for people that need retraining. How are we going to support people through when there is not as much work because of the robots and AI taking over? And he starts discussing the old universal basic wage. Again, another New World Order kind of idea. It all sounds a bit like a communist regime, actually. But anyway, let me just do a little quote from Harari at the end of this chapter of Work. What is basic? Universal basic support is meant to take care of basic human needs, but there is no accepted definition for that. I'm just going to end the quote there. That's true. We may need, what's basic for one person may not be for another, but that's because many people don't quite understand what it is they need to survive. Obviously, we need air, we need water, and we need food. And then would start coming, we need warmth, and we need a roof over our heads and such like. But let me continue with Harari quote now. From a purely biological perspective, a sapien needs just 1,500 to 2,500 calories per day in order to survive. Anything more is a luxury. I'm just going to end the quote there. I do agree with that. I think people eat far too much, and I also know many people live to eat. I remember during, again, the shit show of 2020, people were telling me that the only thing they were looking forward to was their lunch and their dinner during all the lockdowns. And it's like, that's quite sad that all you did was think about food. Needed to perhaps take up some new hobbies, or maybe that was the time to start rethinking and re-evaluating your life if all you was interested in was what was coming at lunchtime and dinner time. Anyway, that's just my own personal thought. As he does say here, anything more is a luxury. People do overeat, definitely. And sadly, there's also lots of people still starving in the world. It's just ridiculous how the imbalance is. Anyway, I'm going to continue with this quote. Yet, over and over and above this biological poverty line, every culture in history defined additional needs as basic. In medieval Europe, access to church services was seen as even more important than food because it took care of your eternal soul rather than of your ephemeral body. In today's Europe, decent education and healthcare services are considered basic human needs, and some argue that even access to the internet is now essential for every man, woman and child. End quote. I do see how a good education and healthcare is a basic need, but it's not a survival need. The survival need is that we always need food, water and air. So these are kind of like the next stage of what we should have as a basic need or basic support. And everybody deserves an education. I think everybody should learn to read and write, because it gives you not just advantages in life, but it's a way of communication. And of course, if we can all get good health care, even better. But maybe if we understood how to treat our bodies and our minds a bit better, we wouldn't need all these healthcare services that are full of the pharmaceuticals. We need to have instead a kind of mind, body and spirit holistic service. But I did find it interesting that some argue that even access to the internet is essential. And I see that in a lot of people. They feel quite lost when their phones are not connected to their internet, and they feel quite lost if they haven't got their internet to suddenly, I don't know, look at what's going on in the world. And many of them I watch a lot of people from on trains and tubes. What are they looking at on their phones? Most people are just swiping constantly. They're looking at them little short films that are probably, very few of them actually have anything that's actually worthy of taking into your body. Most are very frivolous little films. I've caught a lot of people watching porn on a train. Anybody could watch them or catch a glimpse of that. If children see it, because some men, I've not seen a woman yet doing it, but definitely caught a few men watching porn on their little phones. I think there is a law coming in to stop all that in the UK. Some things are meant to be private, and things like watching porn on a train, which still to me, I don't understand why men do it. They're obviously getting that little bit of titillation on the train, but where does it lead to? They're going to have all that testosterone built up inside them. They can't sit there and have a Tommy Tank on the train, or go and maybe they rush home and call up a special number of a lady of the night, or what some people say it's the street ladies, to fulfill their needs. But to me, that's kind of odd that everybody's driven by sex. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people are driven by sex. It's in the music, the pop music they watch. I'm sure our food's probably been given lots of stuff to raise our sexual vibrations, and we're being shown sex on TV or told that we should all be having sex all the time. It's the way to a fulfilling life, or as we all know, it isn't. Most people are just having sex to release some kind of built up, pent up energy inside them. And many people mistake sex for love these days. A lot of people are looking for love, and they think that by getting involved in sexual antics it's like a very poor substitute for love. I myself was a bit like that as a teenager. I thought that if I slept with a guy, he would fall in love with me, but it took me a long time to realise, no, that's not how it works. Love is a very high vibration. Sex is obviously a very low vibration, and the cabal of this world is trying to keep us in lower vibration. Yet at the same time, delude us to think that we're doing the right thing and that we'll all be the ones that everybody looks up to. But I just wanted to read some more from Hari here. He says, hence, even if some universal support scheme provides poor people in 2050 with much better healthcare and education than today, they might still be extremely angry about global inequality and the lack of social mobility. People will feel that the system is rigged against them, that the government serves only the super rich, and that the future will be even worse for them and their children, end quote. And many people feel that way today, so I can see how that's building up and coming forth. Many people are, like I was saying just now, keeping up with the Joneses, so they see other neighbours are doing better than they are. And then you've got also in the cities the differences between the dregs of the town, those that can't afford to live properly and living off all benefits and such, like at one end, and then it goes into the middle version of people that are working class and can afford to live somewhere but are just about making it through life, onto the middle class that would be the ones that earn enough to have that lovely few luxury holidays every year up to the rich at the other end. And Harari goes on to say, Homo sapiens is just not built for satisfaction. Human happiness depends less on objective conditions and more on our own expectations. Expectations, however, tend to adapt to conditions, including to the conditions of other people, end quote. Which is what I mean. People are looking up at what other people are doing, trying to keep up with the Joneses, seeing that that guy over there is getting a much better deal with his car than the one that you're getting with your car, and such like. Or that woman's thinking, well, she's got all the mod cons in her kitchens where I'm having to still do everything by hand. These kind of things are what are dividing people. He goes on to say, if universal basic support is aimed at improving the objective conditions of the average person in 2050, he says here, but I think it's going to be coming a lot sooner, it has a fair chance of succeeding. But if it is aimed at making people subjectively more satisfied with their lot and preventing social discontent, it is likely to fail, end quote. Which I find is quite interesting, really, because what we're trying to do is to prevent the social discontent that is amongst many people. How do we change that? He goes on to discuss how in some communities that do well and live in a perhaps more successful way to most people, it's because they've got community bonds, which helps keep the community work together. Everybody's wanting the same thing. Everybody's looking after each other's children. There's a lot more, he says, it generates more joy and engagement and insight into what everybody's doing in their lives. They try to support each other. Community makes people feel as though they are a part of something, which is what we are all looking for as humanity. We are a herd, and I'm not talking just about herd mentality, but we are social beings. Humanity, men and women, are social beings, and we all want to live happily. Deep down, we all want to be living in a world where everybody can shake hands with their neighbour and welcomes their neighbour, no matter what their gender, their race, their colour, and such like. Each human accepts the other human. Chapter 3 is liberty, and I'm all up for liberty. Freedom of choice, freedom of speech, freedom of being who you want to be, as long as you're not harming anybody else. Harari writes, the liberal belief in the feelings and free choices of individuals is neither natural nor very ancient. For thousands of years, people believed that authority came from divine laws rather than from the human heart, and that we should therefore sanctify the word of God rather than human liberty. Only in the last few centuries did the source of authority shift from celestial deities to flesh and blood humans, end quote. Well, in the past we were probably more connected to God than we are now, and from Rudolf Steiner's point of view in spiritual science, ancient humans were connected to the gods. And in ancient Egypt, the gods walked with the peoples in the Septepi times. But over time, the gods withdrew, humans got an ego, and thus began to think for themselves. And maybe we do still get divine revelation sent to us, but who of us is open enough to receive it? Most of us are shut off now. As Gurdjieff says, we had the Kundabuffer put in, saw the world turned upside down. When it was taken out, we were still living as if the world was turned upside down. We lost our connection to the divine. But Harari goes on to say, quote, soon authority might shift again from humans to algorithms, just as divine authority was legitimized by religious mythologies and human authority was justified by the liberal story. So the coming technological revolution must establish the authority of big data algorithms while undermining the very idea of individual freedom, end quote. And the subtitle to this chapter is Big Data is Watching You, and he's talking here about how all the coming technology and the algorithms, well, they're already dominating our lives, aren't they? The algorithms watch everything we do online and try to set up algorithms that suit you so that you get the adverts you need, or you get the information you need because you've been looking at it, in other places on the internet. But he also talks about feelings, which I find quite interesting. He's talking about how we need to look into the way our brains and bodies work. What are the scientific ways of looking at our way we have thoughts, feelings, how we move and such like. And he sometimes comes across as saying that everything's mechanical. He suggests that our feelings are not uniquely human spiritual quality. And he goes on to say, and I quote, "and they do not reflect any kind of free will. Rather, feelings are biochemical mechanisms that all mammals and birds use in order to quickly calculate probabilities of survival and reproduction. Feelings aren't based on intuition, inspiration, or freedom. They are based on calculation," end quote. Which many are, especially nowadays, I can see that. But deep down, our feelings are to do with our free will, whether we have free will or not. This is why I believe the divine has left us to our own devices. The divine stepped away from this earth to let us humans have free will so that we can develop ourselves in whatever way we want to. We have the choices of whether we want to reconnect with the divine or not. We have the choices to live how we want to live, even though most people like to be told what to believe in and what to do. But he also goes on to say, I quote, "Feelings of sexual attraction arise when other biochemical algorithms calculate that a nearby individual offers a higher probability of successful mating, social bonding, or some other coveted goal. Moral feelings such as outrage, guilt, or forgiveness derive from neural mechanisms that evolved to enable group cooperation," end quote. And I see that is happening nowadays. Many people feel this is an unjustified world and people get away with doing bad things all the time. People want justice. They're waiting for someone to come and put justice, be a saviour, put everything back to all goodness and light, to put the bad in bad places and to elevate the good. And I do see how that kind of thought pattern has enabled group cooperation. This is why we have justice systems in our legal systems. But he also goes on to say that all these biochemical algorithms were honed through millions of years of evolution. If the feelings of some ancient ancestor made a mistake, the genes shaping these feelings did not pass on to the next generation. Feelings are thus not the opposite of rationality. They embody evolutionary rationality, end quote. And I see how humans are evolving. I don't believe in that we came from monkeys. I don't believe in the origin of species theory. I believe that us humans were created by the divine, whether you go for the Adam and Eve story or any other story that starts with a God putting us here on earth. And that we, because we've been left by the gods, we are evolving in the way we try to adjust to become a good society. But he goes on to say, quote, "We usually fail to realise that feelings are in fact calculations, because the rapid process of calculation occurs far below our threshold of awareness. We don't feel the millions of neurons in the brain computing probabilities of survival and reproduction, so we erroneously believe that our fear of snakes, our choice of sexual mates, or our opinions about the European Union are the result of some mysterious free will," end quote. And that reminds me of what Gurdjieff says, that we are all automatons. So everybody is following along with whatever is the required fad or theme of the day, rather than thinking for themselves and seeing what's right and what's wrong, and freeing themselves from this mechanical way of thinking. He goes on to discuss how nobody can know our inner thoughts or feelings, which is true. People guess at what other people are thinking or feeling. Some people can read other people by their facial impressions or their movement, or people think they're disguising what they're really thinking, but some people are able to read other people. But he talks about, and I quote, even if the Spanish Inquisition or the Soviet KGB spied on me every minute of every day, they lack the biological knowledge and the computing power necessary to hack the biochemical processes shaping my desires and choices. For all practical purposes, it was reasonable to argue that I had free will, because my will was shaped mainly by the interplay of inner forces, which nobody outside could see. I could enjoy the illusion that I control my secret inner arena, while outsiders could never really understand what is happening inside me and how I make decisions." End quote. And this is something of what he was saying earlier about controlling thoughts and feelings. This way everybody would be able to understand each other, which would be an ideal world, wouldn't it? If we could all understand why certain people react this way or act this way or don't think the same as each other. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about how, the crime lords feel they have the right to run, mafia type organisations to get what they want with no concern about anybody else. Just as an example, obviously there's other kinds of people that act like this as well. We have the narcissists and the sociopaths out there that try to control their own outer world, control the people they know, control their families and such like. But is free will a myth, he asks, whereas I think it's not. Free will is something that was given to us for us all to do. But he starts talking again about the revolution of the coming technology. And he says, quote, "On the one hand, biologists are deciphering the mysteries of the human body, and in particular of the brain and of human feelings. At the same time, computer scientists are giving us unprecedented data processing power. When the biotech revolution merges with the infotech revolution, it will produce big data algorithms that can monitor and understand my feelings much better than I can, and then authority will probably shift from humans to computers. My illusion of free will is likely to disintegrate as I daily encounter institutions, corporations and government agencies that understand and manipulate what was hitherto my inaccessible inner realm." End quote. But this is people being lazy, not learning to understand themselves, to look at their inner self. Most people don't want to dive deep into themselves. They just want to put on a mask, a persona. And by doing the Gurdjieff work, surely I am learning to recognize my inner self, to understand who I am as a person and have inner considering as well as outer considering, which I feel Harari is kind of avoiding. Maybe he hasn't understood how this kind of Gurdjieff work or the Steiner work or any other path such as Gurdjieff or Steiner helps one to develop themselves without the need of a chip being put into our brain. He talks about how, today we're enjoying the best healthcare we've ever had in history. But he goes on to say, but for precisely this reason, they will probably be sick all the time. There is always something wrong somewhere in the body. There is always something that can be improved. In the past, you felt perfectly healthy as long as you didn't sense pain or you didn't suffer from an apparent disability such as limping. But by 2050, thanks to biometric sensors and big data algorithms, diseases may be diagnosed and treated long before they lead to pain or disability." End quote. So he's talking about once we've got these chips in our heads or these computers that can analyse us, they'll be able to tell us, hey, you've got some health issues coming up, things that's trying to kill you. But as he does later go on to say, will people listen to this? Will they be interested in telling us the smartphones or these chips inside us, telling us that we've got all these dangerous cells within us that need to be healed, that you need to go to a doctor and get some pharmaceutical medicine? And then on the other hand, he talks about how hypochondriacs will, I'm going to just read the quote. "Hypochondriacs might dutifully read these updates, but most of us will ignore them just as we ignore those annoying antivirus notices on our computers." End quote. Humans like to be told by humans what's wrong with them, though sometimes we don't like to hear what's being told us. Nobody wants to hear that they've got some awful disease that could kill them. Nobody likes to be given advice. Well, people do like advice. Most people listen to people because they don't know what to do with themselves or how to handle something. It's good to get advice sometimes, but we need to make the decisions ourselves. But he goes on to say that in the future, all these algorithms will understand us, humans, better than we understand ourselves. And he says, and I quote, "And that is not so difficult because most people don't know themselves very well, and most people often make terrible mistakes in the most important decisions of their lives," end quote. And then he goes on to talk about how we all have insufficient data because we're all faulty programming in ourselves, which again Gurdjieff and Steiner are kind of telling us because we work from personality and not from essence. Harari goes on to talk about how, these algorithms of the future might tell us who we should marry, tell us what we should be eating. And I was telling a friend once about how all this smart technology that's coming in the future, he's a bit of an alcoholic, my friend, and I was saying that, when the smart technology comes in, they'll only allow you certain beers a day, and then they'll lock your fridge. And he went, "I will go to the pub." Well, the pub will be linked up to that algorithm in the fridge, the computer in the fridge, and the bartender won't be allowed to sell you beer because he's been told not to. And if he did, then he'll be in terrible trouble. Though, as my friend did remark and reply to me, there'd be some kind of black market to get round all that anyway. But then this is what all this big data and all these control freaks of governments that are trying to bring in this new world order are trying to do, stop things like black markets, many of which do horrendous things. But again, it's taking away our free will. We're free human beings. Our liberty should be ours. He then goes on to talk about how we all have our different fears and fantasies to deal with. And he starts saying that and I quote, "Your judgment is clouded and manipulated by Hollywood blockbusters, trashy novels, and sophisticated advertising campaigns. It is particularly difficult to make a wise decision because you don't really know what it takes to succeed in different professions, and you don't necessarily have a realistic image of your own strengths and weaknesses. What does it take to succeed as a lawyer? How do I perform under pressure? Am I a good team worker?" End quote. And these are good things to be thinking about in ourselves. Whereas I do agree, most people would rather go home and watch a Hollywood blockbuster or read some trashy novel than something that would be more helpful to our own development of ourselves, something more philosophical. Though I do notice some Hollywood blockbusters nowadays are trying to make us think for ourselves and give us a new way of thinking. But they are rare. And he goes on to talk about how AI will make better decisions than we do about our careers and relationships and such like. Will humans be happy to be dependent on artificial intelligence and the algorithms to decide what we do with our lives? Or will people revolt against that and want to still make their own decisions? And as he says here, quote, "But once we begin to count on AI to decide what to study, where to work, and who to marry, human life will cease to be a drama of decision-making," end quote. Well, I think some people like to make their own decisions, don't they? Though I can't deny I've made many wrong decisions in my life over the many years that I've been on this planet, as many other people have. Very few of us get it right first time. And this is something that did worry me. He goes on to say, quote, Democratic elections and free markets will make little sense. So would most religions and works of art," end quote. Because the AI will start telling us that this isn't meaningful to our lives, maybe. I don't know. I'm a bit concerned about it telling us that this kind of thing is not going to make sense. I can imagine the AI computer doesn't want us to believe in that fantasy God that's up there in a fantasy heaven, or that works of art are just imaginations and not real life. But works of art are expressions of our free will and our freedom and what we are thinking and feeling. I personally think that being told what to do takes the risk out of our lives. We like a bit of risk. We like to think that we're in control of our lives. But maybe some people feel that they have no control of their lives, so having the algorithm and the AI telling them what to do, well, it's a bit like all those tarot readers that I know. I've known a few over the years who don't do anything unless they draw a card to tell them whether or not to do that thing or how their day's going to be. I think it's quite interesting that he talks about how we used to rely on philosophers, prophets and priests to guide us in our lives. And I still think philosophers, prophets and priests still can guide us. Obviously there's many different versions of philosophy and there's many different versions of priests. I don't think there's too many prophets around these days, though some might like to think they are. Maybe some of these are taking us down dark rabbit holes, but at the same time they help us to think there's other ways, or to think of in other ways, not be narrow-minded. It gives us the opportunity to look at different ways of dealing with our lives by hearing from a philosopher, there's this type of fault or that type of fault, or listening from a prophet, this could happen or this is going to happen, or listening to a priest to help us have our moral and ethical ideologies to keep us more open-minded and perhaps open our hearts to other people and ourselves. I think that's another problem with this world at the moment. Many people's hearts are closed. But also with the Gurdjieff work and the Steiner work, they're helping us to connect with our subconscious, which is something that computers do not have and cannot work with. Our subconscious does affect us a lot more than maybe many people like to admit. Our subconscious creeps up on us. And sometimes guides us, sometimes warns us, sometimes gives us information that the normal conscious world, or looking at just at the outer world without having any in consideration, can guide us in a way that artificial intelligence and algorithms cannot. But then, will the computers come alive? He talks about how AI is not conscious, but as we know, everything has consciousness to a certain degree, and I'm concerned about the dark forces. They have a consciousness, but not necessarily a conscience, and I think that they have an inner intelligence with technology. From a spiritual science point of view, the technology could be infiltrated by the dark forces and then would be able to manipulate us to do what they want, such as distract us from our spiritual path, separate humanity, as is happening today as people are being disconnected to other humans and are more connected to their technology as they walk down the road looking at their phone. So maybe people won't mind being plugged into some kind of artificial intelligence technology that's going to link us all together. Though I've said before, I don't really want to be able to hear and think about other people's thoughts. And Harari goes on to say, quote, AI often frightens people because they don't trust the AI to remain obedient. We have seen too many science fiction movies about robots rebelling against their human masters, running amok in the streets and slaughtering everyone. Yet the real problem with robots is exactly the opposite. We should fear them because they will probably always obey their masters and never rebel. End quote. Interesting, hey? But then maybe I can see that from a human point of view. Too many humans are programmed, follow their programming, and don't wake up. They stay asleep and just follow along with what they're told to do, and live in what could be considered a prison-type planet, though they are getting everything they need, even though they still have their stress and their worries. They think that this kind of life is okay because they're fast asleep. Or they think they are awake. As Gurdjieff says, people think they are awake. But Harari goes on later to say in this chapter, quote, as algorithms come to know us so well, authoritarian governments could gain absolute control over their citizens, even more so than in Nazi Germany, and resistance to such regimes might be utterly impossible. Not only will the regime know exactly how you feel, it could make you feel whatever it wants. End quote. And this, of course, is one of the concerns of the future. if we suddenly realise we don't like what this authoritarian government is doing to us all and that it has control over us, it will know instantly if we're all linked in. And before you know it, you find yourself in the gulag. But in some ways, Harari seems to be giving us a warning about all this. I quote, "At the highest levels of authority, we will probably retain human figureheads who will give us the illusion that the algorithms are only advisors and that ultimate authority is still in human hands. We will not appoint an AI to be the Chancellor of Germany or the CEO of Google. However, the decisions taken by the Chancellor and the CEO will be shaped by AI. The Chancellor could still choose between several different options, but all these options will be the outcome of big data analysis, and they will reflect the way AI views the world more than the ways humans view it." End quote. Which is true if they're too reliant on the AI to tell them what to do or what's the best scenario for the future or for a certain situation. The AI, as I was saying earlier, doesn't have a subconscious, doesn't have feelings. It's just a rationalistic way of thinking. It's mechanical, not human. And he goes on to remind us that the basic plot of almost all movies and novels about AI revolves around the magical moment when a computer or a robot gains consciousness. Well, I think they are gaining consciousness myself. But I'm just going to quote him here. "And intelligence is the ability to solve problems. Consciousness is the ability to feel things such as pain, joy, love, and anger. We tend to confuse the two because in humans and other mammals, intelligence goes hand in hand with consciousness. Mammals solve most problems by feeling things. Computers, however, solve problems in a very different way." End quote, which is what I was just saying. Computers are going to come from just a rationalistic, algorithmic intelligence unless they become conscious. Though Harari goes on to say later, quote, "Of course, it is not absolutely impossible that AI will develop feelings of its own. We still don't know enough about consciousness to be sure. In general, there are three possibilities we need to consider. 1. Consciousness is somehow linked to organic biochemistry in such a way that it will never be possible to create consciousness in non-organic systems. 2. Consciousness is not linked to organic biochemistry, but it is linked to intelligence in such a way that computers could develop consciousness, and computers will have to develop consciousness if they are to pass a certain threshold of intelligence. 3. There are no essential links between consciousness and either organic biochemistry or high intelligence. Hence, computers might develop consciousness, but not necessarily. They could become super intelligent while still having zero consciousness." End quote. So does superintelligence come with consciousness? From the Gurdjieff point of view, being and knowledge creates wisdom. So do computers have being? They might have the intelligence, but will they have the wisdom to use that intelligence wisely? Harari doesn't think we can program conscious computers. And then he says, anytime soon. So he has this idea that this might come. He says, quote, "Hence, despite the immense power of artificial intelligence, for the foreseeable future its usage will continue to depend to some extent on human consciousness." End quote. Now, he seems to be saying that many of us rely on computers because we don't have the genius or the intelligence to work things out for ourselves, though computers are handy in doing mathematical computations and such like. I'm quite concerned that many essays are now being written by ChatGPT and such like, so it's stopping people learning how to write and think for themselves. And then I found this quote in his book, which kind of says everything that I'm trying to say here. Quote, "The danger is that if we invest too much in developing AI and too little in developing human consciousness, the very sophisticated artificial intelligence of computers might only serve to empower the natural stupidity of humans." End quote. That is something I am concerned about. We don't want to dumb ourselves down. We should be getting more and more intelligent. He starts talking about a possible robot rebellion in the coming decades. And obviously they might be able to, he says here, quote, know how to press our emotional buttons better than our mother and use this uncanny ability to try and sell us something, be it a car, a politician, or an entire ideology, end quote. I thought that was very interesting because that is true. We already have advertising thrown at us all the time, usually through the algorithms, can now specify certain adverts just for each person. And he talks about how these bots can start identifying what our deepest fears are and what our cravings are and use this against us. And this could be something hackers in the future use to manipulate us. And I think that's happening already, really. And then he finishes this paragraph with a quote which I quite like. Quote, while science fiction thrillers are drawn to dramatic apocalypses of fire and smoke, in reality we might be facing a banal apocalypse by clicking, end quote. I think that's hilarious. But he does talk about how we're spending so much money on this computer development and development of AI. And then he says something about how we should really be spending it on advancing human consciousness, which is something I truly believe in as well. We should be researching how humans work and think and feel, rather than what computers can do for us. We should be learning how the human being lives, whether it's from a spiritual point of view. This should be considered as well. It's like bringing the spiritual and the scientists together again, bring back the religious priests, scientists. He writes, we are now creating tame humans that produce enormous amounts of data and function as every efficient chips in a huge data processing mechanism. But these data cows hardly maximize the human potential. Indeed, we have no idea what the full human potential is because we know so little about the human mind. And yet we hardly invest much in exploring the human mind and instead focus on increasing the speed of our internet connections and the efficiency of our big data algorithms. If we are not careful, we will end up with downgraded humans misusing upgraded computers to wreak havoc on themselves and on the world, end quote. You know, I'm quite concerned that in the future people will be just stuck indoors playing games and watching videos of reality type YouTubers, bloggers and such like, rather than developing themselves. I find this all quite interesting, that he seems to be warning us of all this, yet at the same time he sometimes comes across a bit of New World Ordery. And I mentioned bringing together religion and science. We need the religious scientists, the spiritual scientists. Obviously this is a term that Rudolf Steiner took up from anthroposophy. Spiritual scientist. I'm trying to be a spiritual scientist, understanding how we work as humans, as well as understanding the world and what technology can do for us in the future and our own progress in the science realms, not just technology, but in the chemical, physics and such like realms. But in the chapter called Religion of Harari's book, which is chapter 8, God Now Serves the Nation, he writes, quote, even mental illness, the last bastion of religious healers, is gradually passing into the hands of the scientists, as neurology replaces demonology and Prozac supplants exorcism, end quote. Well, I find that quite interesting that in the last few years, the call for demonologists has risen. I know the Catholic Church has had to start teaching its priests how to do exorcisms again because people are becoming aware that the dark forces are out there. Science, mainstream science, ignores the fact that this is a spiritual war that's going on. And if it doesn't take that on board, it will lose all its science over to the dark forces, which is why things need to be spiritualized. He goes on to write later in this same chapter, traditional religions have lost so much turf because, frankly, they just weren't very good in farming or healthcare. The true expertise of priests and gurus has never really been rain-making, healing, prophecy or magic. Rather, it has always been interpretation. A priest is not somebody who knows how to perform the rain dance and end the drought. A priest is somebody who knows how to justify why the rain dance failed and why we must keep believing in our God, even though he seems deaf to all our prayers. End quote. Well, God does seem to be deaf to all our prayers. Maybe because we don't pray consciously, as Gurdjieff would say. And God doesn't fulfill everyone's prayers. We've been given free will to do what we want. If God answered everybody's prayers, then we wouldn't have free will. He'd be intervening and it'd become kind of like a tyranny. God will be dictating everything, where we are humans with free will to do what we want. And obviously with the weather changes of the last few years, a lot of that is down to us having polluted the planet, really. But free will is an important part of why the world is as it is. But we still need priests for spiritual development. We still need gurus to remind us of our hearts and our mystical paths that we could take. And the shaman of this world still have contact with the earth that maybe we are losing contact with those that aren't following that kind of path. He then goes on to say, quote, "Yet it is precisely this genius for interpretation that puts religious leaders at a disadvantage when they compete against scientists. Scientists too know how to cut corners and twist the evidence, but in the end the mark of science is the willingness to admit failure and try a different tact. That's why scientists gradually learn how to grow better crops and make better medicines, whereas priests and gurus learn only how to make better excuses." End quote. I find that quite funny, really. I do understand the difficulties priests and gurus come up against. I myself get questioned quite a lot as to why God doesn't come and help those that are in need. But again, it's down to the free will. But I am also concerned about what many of these scientists are doing to our crops and our cows and our milk, all being infiltrated with all kinds of chemicals and such like, to supposedly for our good, when really we need everything to stay natural. And I'm going to give you an example of this. This last year I've met and known many people who have their own chickens, so I get a lot of eggs that are natural, not being put through any processing plant, and I can taste the difference in them. They taste much better than those that when I go to, say, away on holiday and I get given my eggs cooked up by the hotel. They're normally processed eggs and they do not taste as good. But I know for mainstream people, and they just don't care about what the quality of their food is. They're happy to have this processed food, which then causes them health problems, but they don't seem to see the connections. But going back to Harari, he goes on to say, quote, "While science provides us with clear-cut answers to technical questions such as how to cure measles, there is considerable disagreement among scientists about questions of policy. Almost all scientists concur that global warming is a fact, but there is no consensus regarding the best economic reaction to this threat. This does not mean, however, that traditional religions can help us resolve the issue. Ancient scriptures are just not a good guide for modern economics, and the main fault lines, for example, between capitalists and socialists don't correspond to the divisions between traditional religions." End quote. I say bring back the priest kings. See my video on Bring Back the Priest Kings. Ancient scriptures do give us good guidance. They might need deciphering, but they give us good guidance on how to treat each other, how to connect to God, and how to treat the planet and the live crops and livestock that we work with. It's awful how some of this wild stock, or not wild stock, the farm stock is used, how cows and pigs, the awful things that they're put through just so that we can have their processed slice of bacon on our breakfast plate the next day. We treat animals in that kind of way awfully. Thankfully, there are farms out there now that treat the animals in a much better way. We have free-range chickens and free-range cows, But some of these abattoirs have a lot to answer for, and that will fall on the karma of those that work there and put these animals through such awful things just to make sure that we've got the best juices in that meat, milk, or whatever. Before I read the next quote, I want to remind everybody that symbolism has power. Quote, during the 19th and 20th centuries, Muslims, Jewish, Hindu and Christian thinkers railed against modern materialism, against soulless capitalism, and against the excesses of the bureaucratic state. They promised that if they were only given a chance, they would solve all the ills of modernity and establish a completely different socio-economic system based on the eternal spiritual values of their creed. Well, they have been given quite a few chances, and the only noticeable change they have made to the edifice of modern economies is to redo the paintwork and place a huge crescent, cross, Star of David or on the roof, end quote. I think that's terrible what he says there. I think that all the different Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Christian thinkers are trying to change things and are trying to help people discover their souls. And they've not just slapped a bit of paintwork up. I've gone to many different religious institutions over the years to see how they're trying their best to help people find their way back to God. And by putting a new crescent, cross, Star of David or on the roof, they put into that symbolism the meaning behind what that is trying to do, the connection to God. And Om is the creative word. If people can feel that in their hearts and in their bodies resonate, it will help them to find connection. Obviously, we need to say our mantras over and over again, and not in a mechanical way, in a conscious way. We need to say our prayers consciously. We need to listen to our various priests and thinkers and the Hindu gurus and such like, the Jewish rabbis. They are, even though in some ways they try to divide us over their different religions, they are still trying to unite us to God. But then this is my concern of, this is what New World Order is trying to bring. One world religion. He goes on to slate the religious texts, saying that, you can't really get answers out of them unless you interpret them imaginatively, he says. I'm just going to read a quote here. Having formulated an answer, you then turn to the Quran, for example, and you read it closely in search of some surah that, if interpreted imaginatively enough, can justify the solution you can get from Hayek or Marx. So, end quote. He's trying to say that we're just making things up. But I must admit, many times I have got the answer I've wanted from a religious text by taking a religious text of some kind, whether it's the Quran or the Torah or the Bible or some Hindu text, before I open the book, formulating the question that I'm trying to find an answer to, and I open it randomly, and normally that answer is there on the page that I've opened to randomly. Because I believe that we are being guided from above. And so whether it's an angel, an archangel, our higher self, or God himself, trying to guide us to the spiritual answer we need for these problems, it is there. But he seems to be ignoring that kind of thing. He then goes on to say, quote, not that there aren't any economic ideas in the Bible, the Quran or the Vedas, it is just that these ideas are not up to date, end quote. Because he's talking about how we can't get economic answers through the religious text. But I personally think that's because the economics, money and such like, was the work of the devil. But it does talk about economics in these texts and how we should work fairly. We should work with money and economics in a justified way so that each man and woman and child is not being ripped off, not being robbed, and always having a roof over their heads and food on their plate. Can be done if we become a society, a community that works together. But also, that's the exoteric way of thinking of things. The esoteric way is the spiritual fulfillment, spiritual food. That's what we need to help develop ourselves. And once we're working with ourselves from a spiritual point of view, we then can also work from the exoteric way of trying to make society a better place. And he goes on to say, quote, "So what difference would religion make when facing the big questions of the 21st century? Take for the example the question whether to grant AI the authority to make decisions about people's lives, choosing for you what to study, where to work, and whom to marry. What is the Muslim position on that question? What is the Jewish position? There are no Muslim or Jewish positions here. Humankind is likely to be divided into two main camps, those in favour of giving AI significant authority and those opposed to it. Muslim and Jews are likely to be found in both camps and to justify whichever position they espouse through imaginative interpretations of the Quran and the Talmud." End quote. Well, this is something I've been thinking about for many years, and I discuss in my book Monkey Mind Robot Body. Blatant plug, I know there, but it is what's going to come in the theological point of view of relying on computers and AI to make decisions for us in our future. And I think that Harari actually is ending this chapter with a bit of fear-mongering about religious divide. He seems to think that all these different religious traditions will just, I'm going to quote here, "fill the world with a lot of ugliness and make people behave meanly and cruelly," end quote. Because he's saying that a lot of wars are over religion, which many people will say they are. But then we need to help these different religious institutions to accept that all paths lead to God. All paths lead to a divine understanding. All paths lead people to open their hearts to one another. They all have an ancient wisdom, an ancient truth as the basis of them. What is causing this difference between all the religious traditions? It is quite weird, isn't it? And it's starting to raise up again. We're beginning to have a religious divide again. But who's doing this? Who's putting these thoughts out into people? I myself seem to see that it's a lot of misinformation and a way of, again, directing people to misuse their perhaps anger or their misery in their own lives to put it on to seeing that it's somebody else's fault. I did have a question about what Harari says, though, about religion and the coming technology. He says, quote, "No matter how archaic a religion might look, with a bit of imagination and reinterpretation, it can almost always be married to the latest technological gadgets and the most sophisticated modern institutions," end quote. And I do notice now that you can watch a lot of services over Zoom, so you're watching it through technology rather than being there and feeling the vibrations created by prayers, services, and obviously hearing choirs sing live has a much better effect on one's body than it does listening to it through a computer. But also there are these AI created priests these days. You can go and listen to an AI priest give you a service. Again, it's losing the human touch, isn't it? The human contact. He goes on to say, quote, "No matter how technology will develop, we can expect that arguments about religious identities and rituals will continue to influence the use of new technologies and might well retain the power to set the world ablaze. The most up-to-date nuclear missiles and cyber bombs might well be employed to settle a doctrinal argument about medieval texts. Religious rites and rituals will remain important as long as the power of humankind rests on mass cooperation and as long as mass cooperation rests on belief in shared fictions," end quote. Well, he's trying to say here that religion is all a fiction. But those that believe, those who are believers, and I believe there are many of them out there, I don't think they will agree with this. And I'd like to think that maybe they will start accepting that other people can find God through different traditions, that there are different paths for everybody. In fact, we should all be walking our own path to God. In some ways, I do think religious institutions do control how people find their path to God. Yet at the same time, there are many people out there that do not have the impulse to do it themselves and need to be led. They want to be led. They want to be told what to believe. But deep down, it should be an inner consideration. And there's nothing wrong with medieval texts. I love a bit of medieval texts. I love going and looking at all the different bestiaries and medieval artwork. It's one of my favourite subjects, as well as all the other religious texts. They are good things to ponder upon, to look at, to consume into our subconscious, to bring it back up into our conscious. But I am concerned that he is trying here to promote New World Order, one world religion. He's saying that all the religions are all against each other, where I'm sure at some point in the future we will all sit down. And I can see the different religious leaders do try and talk to each other. You see the Pope talking to the Russian Orthodox priests and the imams, and you see various multi-faith conventions these days. They are trying to bring religion together, not as a new world one religion order, but to accept each other's different faiths, as we should accept that each person is different and each person we look at has their own faith and belief, their own way of living, and that everybody is suffering and trying to find a way, a path through this world. Compassion and consideration is what we need. Will the computers help us with that? I do not know. Will the computers be able to bring us knowledge? Yes. The wisdom with it is something maybe we need to work out ourselves. We can use the knowledge to understand each other. We can use the knowledge to open up our minds and open up our hearts. Harari's last chapter in the book is chapter 21, called Meditation. Just observe. Wise words. I do indeed believe we need to meditate on things and observe what's going on, and observe ourselves and our own reactions to it. He says, I quote, "Having criticised so many stories, religions and ideologies, it is only fair that I put myself in the fire in line 2 and explain how someone so sceptical can still manage to wake up cheerful in the morning. I hesitate to do so partly for fear of self-indulgence, and partly because I don't want to give the wrong impression, as if what works for me will work for everybody. I am very aware that the quirks of my genes, neurons, personal history and dharma are not shared by everyone. But it is perhaps good that readers should at least know which hues colour the glasses through which I see the world, thereby distorting my vision and my writing." End quote. It then goes on to talk about his own biography. But that is very true for all of us. We should all be aware that we are all different. We all have our own quirks. We all have our own personal history, and dharma, of course. And if we can understand that we are all different, yet we are all the same, as Brian says, you are all unique, you are all individuals. Yes, we are all individuals. That would help us to understand each other better. He goes on to talk about, Harari does, about meditation, and had presumed it must involve all kinds of complicated mystical theories. And in the end says, quote, "I was therefore amazed by how practical the teaching turned out to be." End quote. And then he starts talking about his description of how he learnt meditation. Later he talks about, in the same chapter, quote, "When people ask the big questions of life, they usually have absolutely no interest in knowing when their breath is coming into their nostrils and when it is going out. Rather, they want to know things like what happens after you die. Yet the real enigma of life is not what happens after you die, but what happens before you die. If you want to understand death, you need to understand life." End quote. And I think that is very important. We do need to understand who I am and live our lives. Live as if this is your last day on earth. But that doesn't mean go and do everything, like a... Well, I think what I'm trying to say is try to live as if you want to live it, a well life, a good day. Love everybody. Don't go and seek revenge on people. Instead, understand why that person made you feel so revengeful, why you want vengeance. Understand who you are, what your soul is. Is it there? Is your soul awake? Are you using your soul? Or are you just sleepwalking through life? he does ask a very important question that I think everyone should be asking themselves. What is it that endures from birth to death? And what is it? Is it our spirit? Is it our soul? Who am I? Who are you? Have a look at yourself. What drives you? What are your different personalities? What makes you angry? What makes you happy? Why do things make you angry? Is it something that can be overcome? Because anger is not helping us through life. Obviously there is anger that's needed in justifiable situations, but most people fly off the handle just because they're not getting what they want. It's the same with a lot of the other negative emotions that we go through, such as depression and such like. Normally it's to do with the fact that we're not getting what we want. What is it that we want? And is what we want suitable for living in this world? Or are we just looking for personal subjective means and ends? When really we should be looking at the objective picture. Learning to understand our body, the body's sensations and all our mental reactions is so important in this day and in this world of how we live, which is why obviously I've been trying to tell everybody about Gurdjieff and Rudolf Steiner, because they help us to look at that. Look at who we are, what kind of person we are, and are we living the life that we want to live? So some good questions and points that Harari is putting out in this book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. But we can also get more spiritual understanding of our world from the spiritual texts. And the coming computer and technology might help us to live in a more mechanical, materialistic way better, but we must remember to follow our spiritual and soulful path. Because we don't know what happens after death. I know many people that are not spiritual or soulful think once this life is over, that's it, they're dead, they don't exist anymore. But I've, from my own encounters through my life, realised there's more to life than that, and that there is a soul within us that can be developed. And maybe this life is a training ground for developing your soul so that you go on to the next stage. Or maybe those that don't have a soul just get caught up in the reincarnation cycle and come back again to this earth until they get it right. Normally people that watch my shows are ones that are following a spiritual and soulful path, and as always I encourage you not to fall off it. You will be tested. There will be moments when you think, what is this all about? But just take that moment to observe. Take that moment to take a breath. Take that moment to perhaps meditate on what it is that's causing you some kind of disarray or taking you out of your serene, peaceful way of thinking. But remember that peace, love and life is the way forward. Thank you for watching. And until next time, peace. And be a lion heart in these interesting times.